And this looks like one of my lecture classes. Everyone sits in the back. I know there's a heat gradient, and the further back you are, the warmer it is, I believe. But you all can certainly sit closer if you like. What we'd like to do before we get into the panel discussion moderated by Tom Stegman and Greg Kalscheur is to open the room up and floor up to questions to our four speakers this morning. Phil.
I have a question for the last speaker concerning the economic analysis. It's very, very impressive. But I think the way, my guess is, my hypothesis is that it way undercounts the full economic benefit of the program, because you're only counting costs and benefits, I presume, up until the time they graduate school or something like that. And there must be some way that you can project the difference in life forces between the kids that are in the City Connects program versus the comparison group, just using a simple metric like high school dropout. Although I suspect people are more sophisticated, but even using a simple metric like high school dropout, at the crudest level you could project anticipated lifetime earnings for group A versus group B. And I suspect it would be a massive difference.
Right. They used some of those, the ones that they had. They used some of those, the ones they had the data for. But the high school dropout was a big contributor to the cost benefit. Because if you look at what happens to high school dropouts, then obviously it's a tremendous cost to society. So they built some of those in. But you're right.
And projecting future?
Yes, yeah.
Two words that stuck out to me in your presentation, inculcate and advocate. I don't know if you've used them in verbal form, but my question is, those of us who live in the humanities, how do we reconcile our responsibility to transmit knowledge and present, expose students to diversity perspectives? How do we reconcile that with inculcate? And also advocacy. How do we, again, a diversity perspective versus advocacy? So the public persona versus the academic role.
Right. Let me start with the word inculcate. In a law school setting, there is I believe this is on. Can you hear me now? Very good. There is a body of existing law. And one in some ways, one might say a mundane task of a law school professor is to convey and teach our students what the existing law is. Of course, we do much more than that. We question that law. We examine the social forces that cause the law to be configured as it is today, et cetera. But if we simply start with our constitutional framework and constitutional system of government, that is an existing body of law that I think becomes even more important today as we're transmitting that law in every class to make more overt how that background body of constitutional principles relates to whatever specialized area we're teaching, let's say intellectual property law. In the humanities, your task is very different, and of course there are a number of different fields within the humanities, but I view one very important role of the humanities as shedding light on what undisputed facts are, what contested facts are, why they may be contested, and so there are entire methodologies epistemological technologies and methodologies are having those discussions and reorienting today's conversation back to something that is grounded in a discussion of fact and different views on what facts are. So I think that that's very, very important. And finally, with respect to advocacy, this is, I think, a very personal decision for each of us as to whether we engage in it and what we do. But in humanities, there are entire belief systems and systems of moral values that I think are very much under attack today, and a reiteration and defense of those systems of moral values, I think, is really important today. I tend to do that through the prism of law, but law is just the beginning of that conversation. Thank you.
I kind of wanted to comment on that, too. I was struck by both in Patricia's presentation and Andrea's presentation, there was a discussion of inculcation or virtue or conversion. And I think that connects to the idea that the common good is an ethical concept. It's not a value-free idea. It's about the conditions that need to exist if people are going to flourish. So Andrea talked about the ultimate realization of individual capacities in the social context. There are other places in the Catholic social thought tradition where the common good's been described as the conditions that ought to exist in society if everybody's going to flourish as a person, if we're going to care about their integral development as a person. That's a normative concept that's got ethical bite to it. One of the things that I'm really happy about in the university's conversation about the common good, both with respect to the core and with respect to research, is the way in which it can combine a focus on research with the university's commitment to the formation of students. So we can't care about the common good from a research perspective if we're not trying to shape students who care about the conditions in society that need to exist if everybody's going to flourish. And that's a question of virtue. That's a question of character. So there is a dimension of inculcation of something that needs to be happening in the educational project. Andreas adverted to the fact that this can be controversial, and I think that's right. As we begin to specify what the common good demands, that can be controversial. But I think that's the point of the research project. Can we have good scholarship helping us to really understand on the basis of data and good analysis what will promote human flourishing? It's not something that gets imposed from on high, but it's something that we have to really explore in depth using all the tools that we have, all the different ways of knowing that we have in the life of the university. So this idea of the common good as driving the research project and driving the formative project in education, I think is really important for us going forward. It's heartening to me that that's how the strategic plan has been articulated. And I think there's a critical place for the humanities in that, both in the research area and in the teaching area. Are we exploring in depth with our students the fullness of what it is to be human through literature and through history and through philosophy and theology? Are we helping students to see the range of ways that there are to be human and to inculcate in them a desire to want to promote flourishing in a social context? So it's a pretty rich concept that we're going to need to keep talking about, and it's not a conversation that has an ending point, but it's one that I think we have to be committed to, recognizing that it's a normative conversation and that there may be moments of controversy in it.
I'd like to raise the question. First of all, we had representatives from Theology and Ministry, from education, from law school, and from a nursing school. So we really had, I think, the best of bringing together constituencies of the university. Andrea defined the common good coming from the Catholic social tradition. I'd be curious, are we all, the four of you, if you sat in a room together and discussed the common good, would you come up with, are we talking about the same thing? I guess I'm wondering, we all use that term in our presentation, and I realize it might be hard to discuss this among ourselves, but I wonder if just some talk about what we mean by the common good.
Well, I will say that Ken Hackett, our keynote speaker, tantalized us a little bit by describing how much discussion there's been of the common good and the work that he's done, and then not telling us what the definition was that everyone agreed on. And I come from the management school. I fully expect that the definition of the common good from that perspective would be quite different from the other schools. And I'm not ready to venture my personal definition, but I'd love to be part of this discussion.
And I'm sorry, I didn't mean to exclude you in my coverage of the university.
Mary, what do you think would be different from the management perspective than might come from other schools' perspectives?
I think we tend to start with the structural institutional view and not the personal as much. What is the strategy? And what will be the outcome of the strategy? When I teach in the Managing for Social Impact in the Public Good program, I start with stakeholders. We look at the impacts on all the stakeholders, and the common good is a balance. If we can benefit stakeholders, but I still return, because I'm in the management school, to a triple bottom line kind of approach where we talk about planet and people, but also profits as that third part of the bottom line. So I think that's what's different. The management is always looking at the structure of business and the organizational outcomes for profitability as well as for individual. So I wouldn't be one to say that we don't really have any common good in business. I think we do. And I think increasingly corporate social responsibility understands that, but it hasn't been intrinsically part of the discipline.
And there might be room for a conversation about how different sorts of firms or corporations or entities operate in the social context in ways that do or don't promote everybody's flourishing.
Absolutely. And that is a huge part of the current conversation in management.
In law, one of our enduring conversations is mediating the protection of the individual and individual rights with democratic decision-making, which is a collective effort. And part of I think what we're trying to do at the law school is to have our students both understand and be able to promote engaged conversations with people of multiple points of view. Part of this is this democratic process, but sometimes it's advocacy in courts, sometimes it's legislation. There are many, many fora in which this can take place. But I think it goes to this larger issue that there's a process aspect to fulfilling the common good, which is trying to have common understandings and bridge disagreements, getting each of us to come to understand the other person's point of view and the importance of that, which to me seems even more compelling and pressing today.
Oh, there's a question.
Nadia.
In terms of your analysis, I find it fascinating how you use mathematical techniques, like applied economics as well, in your analysis. In terms of the data you have access to currently, how current is the data, and would it make a difference if you had, in a perfect world, what would be the difference of now versus if you had access to real-time information? Would that make anything you do
Yeah, it's a great question. Actually, some of the data that I showed you initially, the 2016 summary data, the prevalence and the incidence numbers, those are actually derived from a mathematical model. We actually don't know the number of people globally who have HIV. Even our incidence and prevalence is derived from a larger mathematical model because we don't have access to every person on the planet to assess whether or not they have this disease. So to answer your question, we're always about 1 to 2 years behind on data, especially data that comes from a large organization like the World Health Organization or UNAIDS. And having real-time data would be wonderful, but it would obviously complicate the amount of data analysis that we would have to do and the amount of number crunching that we'd have to do. But it would be wonderful if we could have that. Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Just one more. I was thinking that as you're talking about interdisciplinary collaboration, as somebody with an IT background and integration and consultant, what we do is when we have cross-functional teams and we assign experts from all their fields and their specialties, and we all get them in a room, they're assigned to this project. And one of the first things we all do is we get concession on language on the project. What the language means, across the entire spectrum, so that everybody has an expectation of what the language is, so we all use the same language, so we're not talking different languages between the departments. Having that expectation, getting that right out, helps the learning curve instead of being, slow. It kind of goes this way, but you learn that over time. Also, one of the things that I'm thinking about when you're talking is implementing, also while you have projects in multidisciplinary teams, is implementing right from the get-go a change management process that allows you, again, with the expectation of language, that gives you the opportunity to track real time and then go back and evaluate and prioritize based on needs, budgets, and et cetera, et cetera. I think that's what I'm hearing from you. Tell me if I'm wrong, but that sounds, as an IT person, I'm loving what you're saying. I get what you're saying. That's a good thing. It's really about integration, getting everybody on the same page and having the same language. The other thing that I wanted to say is, what do you think, with an administration that we have today, how does a school like our school deal with everyday projects, learnings, and interactions, knowing that with an administration, as you said, has a problem with the truth, has no ethical backbone. It really bothers me today to just everything we hear and do is contrary to what I experience here in real time. So it's like this, as professionals and as teachers, how do you experience this right now, here and now, with your students, in your classrooms, and in your circles?
Well, thank goodness for places like BC. I think one of the things we do is we double down. We double down our commitment to a full, ethical, empirically based education for our students, because that provides an important counterweight, and we send people going forward. Other thoughts?
No, I agree. I think it's a moment for us to be more faithful to who we say we are. So if we're a place that says we care about who the students become as people, as being the ultimate standard by which we judge the success or failure of the institution, and if we have a commitment to character formation as part of that mission, I think we keep doing what we're doing and taking seriously the idea of helping students become well prepared to live in a complicated world and to work for the common good in a complicated world. It matters who they are as people, what their values are, what their commitments are, their commitment to the truth, their commitment to trying to create a society in which everybody can flourish. That's what the place is about. So I think it's important for us to keep being faithful to who we are.
You know, another thing that has made me very proud of BC is the school on a number of occasions has taken a public stance to protect our DACA students. More recently, to call for tax provisions that preserve the ability of our graduate students to afford their graduate educations. And there are times where it's been really imperative for universities to show that they will stand up for their students and for the infrastructure that makes this education possible, and BC has been a leader in doing that.
I guess from a personal perspective, I feel very vulnerable at this point in time, and I let my students know about my vulnerabilities. And I have sort of this discussion with students about how to sort of take that vulnerability and turn it into a strength. So that's sort of the conversations we're having in class, in my classes at least, is students know that I feel vulnerable, and I think that that's a part of them learning about the whole person and interacting with me as a person, not just as a professor. That's just a small example, I guess, to answer your question.
I'd like to ask a question of my friend and colleague from the School of Theology and Ministry, Andrea. You mentioned the roles of both human experience and then Christian faith regarding the question of the common good. So could you talk briefly about how you see the latter, the Christian faith, being very specific to our place as a Jesuit-Catholic university and the discussions here, but also then going beyond that to people who would not share those faith convictions? How does one enter dialogue?
Well, I would say we, as we were highlighting during this conversation, we have the ability of playing a very important role. It is a prophetic role in terms of resistance, in terms of support, in terms of formation, in critical moments. Others are more used to this. Central America, Southern America, even African and Asian countries, where they need to find ways to live their values in social context and political context that are not sharing their values. So I think it is, as we are saying, a very important and critical moment for us. And our faith, I think, helps us to accompany others who are already doing this, who are already engaged and committed. It seems to me that the common good has this ability of highlighting what is profoundly human and is profoundly Christian. Because it is good for the person, it is good for society, it's good for groups, associations. If it is good, it's good for everyone. It's not a sectarian understanding of the good. And so I think as believers, we can see our role as those who accompany and those who are a service of this vision of a good society, of a just society, of a place where it's possible to flourish. So we could say that it is a moment where we feel our vulnerability, but also where we are invited to see how we can become more and more agents of transformation in this moment. This would be the way I would answer.
Having this public commitment to the common good at this moment, I think, is critical. You know, there's a larger societal debate that isn't much using that language. So for us to say as a university, we want to focus research on promoting the common good, we want to focus student formation on helping students be committed to the common good, I think is saying something important and potentially transformative in a moment where that's not the wider social conversation.
and to insist that it's not just anthropocentric. I think that was a very good point you were making. How you read about definitions of the common good or reflections upon it, it really is reflecting upon human good, which obviously is at the heart of it. But also to recognize that it's not temporal just in the sense of in the present, that we've really got to be thinking long-term, such as stewardship and the future.
I think Ginger had a question.
Yeah, thank you. Just building on the conversation, how does the narrative about the common good relate to the narrative of America, which is very individualistic, right? How do we, or is this a conversation that's happening in the classrooms and the conversations that you all are having to help people understand commonality for individual advancement or displacing individual advancement as the key value? Is that something that's coming up a lot?
Let me give you one wonky example. Of course, we've seen that the Affordable Care Act and the discourse around it has been extremely politicized. One of the things I do is teach insurance, and insurance really is a collective mechanism that is statistically based to spread risk among groups. And unless you have a sufficiently large group and hopefully normally distributed risks, it falls apart. And then each individual has to bear the risk by themselves, and it could be financially crushing. And so one of the things I try to do in insurance is to engage my students in a conversation about why organizing the provision of this good collectively is in order to virtually everybody's benefit. And then also have the discussion of why, nevertheless, there has been a lot of political opposition to mandated participation in health insurance, and try to tease out that tension.
Being a university, I think we have examples of a counter-narrative about what it means to be American. So we think that individualism is the dominant character of the United States of America. But, for example, at BC, it is impressive the number of engagements in voluntary work that the students do during their studies, or even the way in which, after the studies, they want to continue to embody a way of being citizens that is not only centered on their own individual realization, but it is attentive to dimensions of justice. So I would say that as every complex society in a globalized and pluralist world, the US have strong elements of individualism, but there are counter elements that probably do not surface enough in the narrative or in the imagination about what is the US, what are the US today, but they are still relevant. So we say it's a mix. The picture is more mixed. We have community engagement, associations, groups, voluntary work that are part of the civil society, of the ethos in the US today, from churches to engaged groups to protect the environment, to local associations for the good of the community or the protection of that part of the land, and so on. So I would personally prefer a more nuanced understanding of the tension between individualism and working for the common good, because it seems to me allows us to see these are the instances of an engagement for justice and for the good that are present in the society.
And a historian could probably nuance both the American story in a way that is different than the current rhetoric and bring it into conversation with the Catholic common good tradition, which has got this strong kind of personalist element, the person and their individual flourishing is important, but a recognition that that happens in a context. It doesn't happen as atomistic individuals. So that's an important part of talking about the common good. But historically, I think the founding era of the U.S., there would have been a lot of conversation about virtue and what do we need in citizenship in order for a republic to survive. So that's part of our story too. We've got to bring that more to the fore.
So as an undergrad student, in our diversity and ethics class, we're talking about kind of how the world ought to be versus how it is. And so as a student who's about to graduate and go off, and I guess what would be your recommendation in terms of if you're trying to impact change, you operate under the assumptions of how the world currently works, and we operate under those assumptions and how we can make incremental change from maybe systems that aren't working in the best way, or operate under assumptions of how it ought to work and try and change systems in that way. Because I think that kind of it's a kind of a realist versus cosmopolitan view, but how does that translate into the actions you do? Because I think that your goals can really affect that. And that was the really thing we kind of started with the entire year, or semester rather, and something that elicited a lot of discussions.
I would say that both end. So we need to have a realistic assessment of how reality is. And also, as I was answering a moment ago, of positive and constructive elements together with negative elements in the social context, in the history of our country. But at the same time, we need to have a vision. We need to have something we strive for, a goal that we want to realize together with others, because we believe it is, with all its limitations, good for us, for others, hopefully for humanity and for the planet. Of course, we need to be, humble, always be attentive to revision, criticism, and assessment of the way in which we portray the goal we want to achieve. Particularly if we want to do it together with others, it cannot be only our own vision. But this tension between realism and creative imagination, I think, is constitutive of who we are as human beings and social beings and political beings. So one of the key elements of Catholic thinking is to avoid a narrow polarization or a limited understanding of the complexity of reality. So both end would be the answer to what you're asking.
And I would add to that the ideal. I mean, to put it as the ideal can, and I'm not saying you were doing this, but it can make it sound like it's not real or it's not attainable. I think what we're talking about here, at least from my perspective, from the Christian faith, would be this is really about our identity and vocation. To be part of a people who are committed to bringing about the kind of world that we believe God intended us to live in. So in that sense, it can really serve as not only inspiration, but really as that which gets me out of bed, that gives me a reason for doing what I'm doing. Now, this has to be done in the real flesh and blood of our lives, in the realpolitik, so one has to have one's eyes and ears open. But it is a both and, but I would really place that ideal more in the sense of, in the realm of identity and vocation, personally and communally, of course.
I might jump in more in giving a couple of examples of, I think, the humbleness that is required in this. A few years ago, I had the great honor and privilege to be a federal regulator, and I came in with an overarching set of reforms that I wanted to introduce and to accomplish, and happily they did get done. But I found in the process that two things. First of all, that I certainly did not have a monopoly on the truth. And the way it came home most powerfully to me was we were revamping federal disclosures for mortgages. And we had set up a very, very elaborate field testing system to take draft disclosures out in the field and have real people use them and see if they were effective. But to kick that process off, we bureaucrats had to sit in a room and draft an initial disclosure. And we all sat there and thought, oh, this would be great and this would work perfectly. And we drafted this thing and we put it out for testing. I remember sitting in Baltimore on the other side of a one-way mirror watching it be tested. Some of our ideas were successful. Some bombed spectacularly. And the people who were testing the forms suggested what might work better. So then we incorporated those suggestions in the next draft and retested again. And 19 rounds later, all over the country, we finally had a form that worked. And that really, really brought home to me that you have to wade out into the world of just ordinary people and work with them to make something work. The other thing I realized where I was, I had a certain degree of arrogance that I wasn't admitting to myself, was when I would meet with industry groups, I tended to I think, be properly wary of lobbying. But there were times where the industry groups would just tell me, the way you want to do this. I would always say, this is what we're thinking about doing, and this is what we're struggling with. And then they'd say, we like your goal, but the way you're going to do it actually won't work for the following real-world reason. And, sometimes, man, they were right. I just didn't know how that part of the world worked in every detail. And so once again, I had to be humble and go out and engage with people and listen to them. So I'd say wade out into the world.
I actually like that thought, because in the university, and I've been around the university for a while, we get lots of terrific ideas around tables. We generate a lot of discussion among ourselves, and it really is in the crucible of the real world, and that's why the research practice partnerships, from my perspective, are so wonderful for us, because it gives us a chance. You called it field testing, but you get a chance to field test your own ideas. And one of the ways we really do teach our students here at BC about the common good is to let them experience from another perspective what life is like for different kinds of groups and different kinds of people. And through their volunteer experiences, their class assignment experiences in the community, and they really can touch and feel. And in a sense, it incarnates the ideas from the university in the flesh. And I think that's a big teachable moment for our students. So once you wade into the world, it'll get real.